High Court finds Syed Saddiq guilty of corruption. Putin welcomes Chinese general in Moscow. Good afternoon and Salam Malaysia Madani. Thanks for tuning in. You're watching World Today and I'm Anto Othman. Now we start off with short updates on local politics. War member of Parliament Syed Abdul Rahman was found guilty of all corruption charges brought against him in 2021. The ruling was made after High Court Judge Dato Azhar Abdul Hamid found the defence failed to cast reasonable doubt against the prosecution's case today.
Syed Saddiq was sentenced to 7 years jail, a 10 million ringgit fine and 2 strokes for criminal breach of trust, CBT. On 22nd July 2021, Syed Saddiq was charged with abetting Bersatu Assistant Treasurer Rafiq Hakim Razali for CBT involving 1 million ringgit of the organisation's funds. He is also charged with misusing property for himself, namely 120,000 ringgit from the Maybank Islamic Berhad account belonging to Armada Bumi Bersatu Enterprise. On 28 October 2022, Syed Saddiq was ordered to enter his defence after the court ruled that the prosecution had successfully adduced credible evidence proving each essential ingredient of the offences.
Now on to foreign news, the Israeli-Hamas conflict. The United Nations Human Rights Chief Volker Turk said the collective punishment by Israel of Palestinian civilians amounts to a war crime, as does the unlawful forcible evacuation of civilians. Now he condemned Israel over the forced evacuations during a visit to the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt, the only way out of the besieged territory that is not only controlled by Israel.
The collective punishment by Israel of Palestinian civilians amounts also to a war crime, as does the unlawful forcible evacuation of civilians.
Speaking of the humanitarian aid that has been delivered through Rafah, he said the lifeline has been unjustly and outrageously thin. There is an urgent humanitarian imperative to reach the population that is increasingly isolated, including in the north and middle areas of Gaza, cut off from the very limited aid that is entering the city. He further said the aid getting through the border is a trickle, adding it was Israel's obligation to ensure a maximum of basic necessities of life that can reach all who need it. He also said the human rights imperatives include the delivery of sufficient humanitarian aid to Gaza and a durable end to the occupation.
In a related development, thousands of Palestinians were fleeing on foot in a surge away from the fighting and intense bombardment by Israel in Gaza.
People walked south from Gaza City, many with nothing but the clothes they wore, while combat raged over a month since the Israeli-Hamas conflict escalated on 7th October. According to United Nations observers, already more than 1.5 million people in Gaza have fled their homes in search of safety, and the pace of Palestinian civilians fleeing south from North Gaza has accelerated as Israel's air and ground campaign has intensified. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said around 15,000 people had fled on Tuesday, compared with 5,000 on Monday and 2,000 on Sunday. The Israeli military attacks have killed more than 10,500 people, many of them children. International concern over the fate of Gaza's civilians, most of whom cannot flee the sealed-off territory, has prompted calls for a ceasefire. Israel, however, has resisted calls by the United Nations and G7 nations for a humanitarian pause in the hostilities to alleviate the suffering in Gaza, saying it will not agree to a ceasefire until the hostages are released.
Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi is expected to attend a summit in Saudi capital on Sunday addressing the Israeli-Hamas war. It would be Raisi's first visit to the Gulf Kingdom since the two countries agreed to restore diplomatic relations after 7 years of severed ties, a deal brokered by China and announced in March.
The summit is being organized by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, a 57-member bloc of majority Muslim countries based in the Saudi coastal city of Jeddah. It is planned to take place one day after an emergency meeting of Arab League leaders on the war, also in the Saudi capital, Riyadh. Raisi and Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, held their first phone call on 12th October in which they both voiced support for the Palestinian cause and discussed the need to end war crimes against Palestine. Neither country recognizes the State of Israel. However, before the war broke out, Saudi Arabia was involved in discussions brokered by the United States about possible normalization. Saudi officials are deeply worried about a possible widening of the war that could derail Prince Mohammed's sweeping Vision 2030 reform agenda intended to transition the world's biggest crude oil exporter away from fossil fuels.
Italian Defense Minister Guido Crosetto said on Wednesday that Italy has sent a hospital ship close to the coast of Gaza to help treat victims of the Israel-Hamas conflict. The ship left on Wednesday from the western Italian port of Civitavecchia with 170 staff, including 30 people trained for medical emergencies. And the minister added that Italy was also working to send a field hospital to Gaza. Crosetto suggested that 2 Italian naval vessels already sent to the region were likely to remain in place. Foreign minister from the G7, which includes Italy, called on Wednesday for humanitarian pauses in the Israel-Hamas war to allow in aid and help the release of the hostages.
Molto semplicemente era per annunciare, poi dopo andrete direttamente a vedere di persona, che oggi partirà nave Vulcano. Nave Vulcano è stata attrezzata con un ospedale che vogliamo mandare vicino alle zone che sono interessate dalla guerra, perché è meglio dare segnali evidenti di quello che l'Italia pensa e di come l'Italia pensa di muoversi.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to arrive late Wednesday and will meet his South Korean counterpart Park Jin the following day to discuss issues including nuclear-armed North Korea. His 2-day trip will be followed by a visit by U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to Seoul next week for minister-level meetings.
The visit comes as Seoul and Washington ramp up defense cooperation in the face of a record-breaking series of weapons tests by Pyongyang this year. A U.S. nuclear weapons-capable B-52 bomber made a rare landing in South Korea last month, less than a week after a South Korean port visit by the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan. It also comes as North Korea is strengthening its relations with Russia. Russia and North Korea, who are historic allies, are both under a raft of global sanctions, Moscow for its invasion of Ukraine and Pyongyang for its testing of nuclear weapons. The country's leaders, Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, held a summit in September in Russia's Far East, with Seoul and Washington subsequently claiming that Pyongyang had begun providing Moscow with weapons. South Korea's spy agency said last week Pyongyang appeared to have received Russian advice on satellite technology in return.
Russian President Vladimir Putin hailed strengthening military ties with Beijing on Wednesday as he hosted a senior Chinese general in Moscow. Russia has bolstered ties with its Chinese neighbor in the last year as it seeks allies against the backdrop of its dragging offensive on Ukraine.
In televised remarks, the Russian president said Moscow and Beijing were not building a Cold War-style military alliance, but said cooperation between them is a serious factor stabilizing the global situation. He said the United States was boosting its military presence in the Asia-Pacific region and that Russia and China would react calmly, carefully, and by strengthening defense capabilities. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu had earlier welcomed Zhang Yuzhia and a Chinese military delegation in a red carpet ceremony in the Russian capital. Zhang told Putin he had come to Russia to further strengthen military technical cooperation. His visit came 3 weeks after Putin went to Beijing in a rare trip abroad. Beijing has become Russia's key political and economic ally amid Moscow's isolation on the world stage, and Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping have presented a united front against the West.
The European Union's executive recommended opening formal membership talks with Ukraine in a major show of support for Kyiv as it battles Russia.
The recommendation by the European Commission is an important milestone in Kyiv's road to Western integration and a geopolitical gambit for the EU. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky hailed the move as the right step for Europe, saying that his country must be in the European Union. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said Ukraine should be required to complete further reforms before a formal start date could be set.
Just to give you an idea, main progress has been achieved on the constitutional justice reform, on the selection of the High Council of Justice, the anti-corruption program, progress on anti-money laundering, important measures to curb the oligarchs' grip on the public life, new media law, and progress on national minorities. The remaining reforms are already on their way, that's good, and the Commission commends these efforts.
The EU's 27 leaders still have to sign off on the recommendation at a summit in December. If accepted, EU officials expect formal accession talks with Kyiv to start next year. Such negotiations take years before candidates meet extensive legal and economic criteria to join. Alongside urging progress for Ukraine, Brussels also suggested member states grant Georgia candidate status. Georgia's Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili congratulated the country on the historic victory, while President Salome Zurabishvili said she was rejoicing. Following this development, several thousand Georgians rallied to voice support for their country's path to EU membership. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said Brussels' recommendation came with a caveat that the Georgian government takes reform steps that mirror the genuine aspirations of the overwhelming majority of its citizens to join the European Union. EU leaders are to take a final decision on granting Georgia candidate status at a summit in December. Georgia applied for EU membership together with Ukraine and Moldova after Russia invaded its pro-Western neighbor in February last year. EU leaders granted candidate status to Kyiv and Chisinau, but urged Tbilisi to first implement judicial and electoral reforms, improve press freedom, and curtail the powers of oligarchs. Membership in the European Union and NATO is enshrined in Georgia's constitution and supported, according to opinion polls, by more than 80% of the country's population.
The U.S. and Italian authorities staged coordinated raids against suspected members of the mafia in Sicily and New York, targeting the powerful Gambino crime family and its associates.
Warrants for the arrests of 17 suspects were executed, 7 in the Palermo region of Sicily and 10 in New York. They stand accused of crimes ranging from mafia and criminal association to extortion, arson and auction rigging. The U.S. Department of Justice later clarified that only 16 of the suspects had actually been detained, saying one individual targeted in Italy remains at large. It confirmed 10 alleged members or associates of the Gambino family had been arrested in the U.S. raids, charged with racketeering conspiracy, extortion, witness retaliation, and union-related crimes. The Gambinos are one of the infamous 5 families of Italian mobsters who dominated organized crime in the New York area for decades. In recent years, the once vice-like grip that the Italian mafia held on New York and other U.S. cities has loosened, in part because of the arrests or death of many of its leaders, as well as the growing presence of criminal gangs dominated by other ethnic groups.
Local authorities in India have said that app-based taxis from other states would not be allowed to enter Delhi as our air quality worsened in the Indian capital. Delhi Environment Minister Gopal Rai said the Transport Department has been asked to ban app-based taxis with registrations outside Delhi from entering the capital city as ordered by the Supreme Court.
Rai said the Delhi government would also present 2 studies before the court on the efficacy of the car rationing scheme known as the odd-even formula. He noted that the 2 mega studies were done by the Harvard and Chicago State University in the US and the Delhi Technical University. The top court has questioned the effectiveness of the odd-even formula to curb pollution and referred to it as optics. Under the formula, cars with odd and even number plates would be allowed to travel on alternate days for a week. Rai said, with respect to the decision of implementing the odd-even formula from 13th November, now a call will be taken to implement it only after the Supreme Court reviews its effectiveness and issues an order. Air pollution in Delhi has been in the severe category level over the past few days, and authorities shut down schools and suspended local sports tournaments and events.
Coming up next, 2 dead after gunman kills 2 protesters in Panama. Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev oversaw a military parade in the main city of Nagorno-Karabakh Wednesday, weeks after his army recaptured the long-disputed region from Armenian separatists in a lightning offensive.
The president's office released images of Azerbaijani troops and a military orchestra lined up formation in the central square of Kankendi, which Armenians refer to as Stepanakert. It showed blue, red, green Azerbaijani flags hoisted in front of the building that once housed offices of Karabakh's separatist leader, with an Azerbaijani emblem on the top of the imposing Soviet-era edifice. Baku and Yerevan fought 2 wars over Azerbaijan's Armenian-populated enclave in 2020 and in the 1990s. Wednesday marks the 3rd anniversary of Azerbaijan's crushing victory in a 6-week war with Armenia that saw Baku recapture swathes of its lands which Armenian forces had controlled for 3 decades. In September, Baku launched an offensive to retake the rest of the region, and after less than 1 day of fighting, ethnic Armenian separatist authorities laid down arms and agreed to reintegrate with Azerbaijan. Internationally mediated talks to achieve a comprehensive peace agreement between the Arch 4 Caucasus neighbors have so far failed to produce a breakthrough.
A gunman killed 2 demonstrators blocking a road in Panama Tuesday in the 3rd week of protests over a big mining contract. Now, authorities arrested the shooter in the Cham district, 80 kilometers west of Panama City. A woman was shot dead when police in Bangladesh opened fire on protesting garment workers who had returned to the streets after rejecting a new pay increase.
A police inspector posted at Dhaka Medical College Hospital, where the body was brought, confirmed the death but could not give further details. A relative of a worker that was involved in the demonstration said police had fired on some 400 workers who were demonstrating for better pay at a key highway in Jarun, in the industrial city of Ghazipur, just outside the capital Dhaka. Security has been tight in key industrial towns outside Dhaka after unions threatened to hold new protest over what they described as farcical wage hike. Several thousand police and paramilitary border guards patrol the towns of Savar, Ashulia, Ghazipur and Hemayetpur, home to more than 2,000 garment factories. The South Asian country's 3,500 garment factories account for around 85% of its $55 billion in annual exports. But conditions are dire for many of the sector's 4 million workers, the vast majority of whom are women whose monthly pay starts at $75. A government-appointed panel decided on Tuesday to raise the figure by 56.25%, but striking workers are demanding a near tripling of the wage, with violent scenes playing out at protests in recent days.
Now, over in southern Paraguay, heavy rains caused by the El Nino weather phenomenon have sent hundreds to shelters in the town of Ayolas, with residents bracing for more flooding on the way.
At least 5 neighborhoods in the town, about 300 kilometers from capital Asuncion, were left underwater after storms last week caused the Kerana River to burst its banks. According to National Emergency Ministry estimates, some 35,000 people throughout the country were affected by the rains, while local authorities in Ayolas, near the border with Argentina, said about 3,700 were displaced. Some locals navigated small boats through the city's still flooded streets on Wednesday. Weather experts predict more storm clouds to roll in over the weekend due to the El Nino effect, caused by a warming of the Pacific Ocean and spurring extreme weather events across the Americas.
Meanwhile, flash flooding in southwestern Somalia has claimed the lives of more than 24 people and displaced hundreds of thousands from their homes as El Nino downpours lash East Africa.
Since the beginning of the month, ferocious rainstorms have hit Somalia and its neighbors Kenya and Ethiopia, triggering landslides and submerging villages and farms. The flooding comes after Somalia and parts of Ethiopia and Kenya suffered the region's worst drought in 4 decades. At least 29 people have died and about 850,000 others have been affected, including over 300,000 who have been uprooted from their homes. The most affected regions were in the southwest of the strife-weary nation of 17 million people. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said rescue efforts were being delayed because roads had been cut. Somalia, as much as the Horn of Africa, is considered one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, but is particularly ill-equipped to cope with the crisis. The United Nations said El Nino, which triggers higher global temperatures, is expected to last until at least April next year.
Still to come in sports, Arsenal extremely close to get into Champions League knockouts. Arsenal are within touching distance of qualifying for the Champions League knockout stages after Leandro Trossard and Bukayo Saka clinched a 2-0 win against Sevilla on Wednesday. Now, Mikel Arteta's side got back on track after successive domestic defeats thanks to Trossard's first half opener and Saka's strike after the break at the Emirates Stadium.
With 3 wins from 4 Group B games, Arsenal sit in first place, 4 points ahead of second place PSV Eindhoven. The North Londoners will be certain to reach the last 16 if they take 1 point from their remaining matches at home to Lens and at PSV. Brushing aside Sevilla was the perfect way to erase the bitter taste of a difficult spell that included the end of their unbeaten start to the Premier League at Newcastle. That loss against Newcastle, whose winning goal by Anthony Gordon was controversially awarded by VAR, sent Arteta into a sustained fury that had hardly subsided in the days since. There were no more VAR dramas to provoke Arteta into another red mist as Arsenal made light work of lackluster Sevilla, who languished at the bottom of Group B without a win.
Meanwhile, Manchester United's poor form continued as they slipped to a stunning 4-3 defeat against FC Copenhagen in their UEFA Champions League earlier this morning. Now, Erik ten Hag's team appeared to be cruising thanks to 2 goals in the first half, an hour by their Danish striker Rasmus Højlund. Yet they suffered a blow when winger Marcus Rashford was controversially sent off in the 42nd minute for a foul on Elias Yallet. Copenhagen took full advantage of the Red Devils' misery to haul themselves level by the break. Mohamed El Younousi pulled one back before Diogo Gonçalves equalized from the spot in the 9th minute of stoppage time. Still, United got back in front via a Bruno Fernandes penalty midway through the second half. However, it was the host's turn yet again to equalize as Lucas Leaya made it 3-3 7 minutes from time. Rooney Bokji, the 17-year-old Kuwait-born Swedish under-21 international, got Copenhagen's winner in the 87th minute. Ten Hag's team have now lost 3 of their 4 Champions League matches in this season and have been beaten in 9 of their 17 games in all competitions. Brahim Diaz, Vinicius Jr. and Rodrigo scored as Real Madrid cruised into the last 16 of the Champions League with 2 group games remaining after a 3-0 victory over Portuguese side Braga. Diaz, who had an earlier goal ruled out for a foul in the build-up, openly scoring for a first-time strike from close range in the 27th minute, assisted by Rodrigo with a low cross. Diaz could have extended their lead in the 55th minute, but goalkeeper Mateus made 2 consecutive reflex saves to deny the Spanish midfielder's double effort from close range. Mateus also stopped a Rodrigo strike from the edge of the box to help Braga stay in the game, but Vinicius Jr. doubled the lead in the 58th minute when he collected a low cross by Lucas Vazquez to strike home a tidy finish from inside the box. 3 minutes later, Vinicius started a counter-attack and played in his compatriot Rodrigo, who netted a brilliant chip over the goalkeeper to secure the result. Real Madrid lead Group C with 12 points from 4 games. They could secure top spot with a point at home in their next game against Napoli. The Italian champions are second on 7 points, 4 clear of Braga in third. Union Berlin are bottom on 1 point after a 1-1 draw against Napoli. Well, that concludes this edition of World Today. In our top story, Syed Saddiq sentenced to 7 years jail, 10 million ringgit fine. Now, tune into Malaysia Tonight, coming up at 8:30 p.m. on TV1 and saluran Berita RTM. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. I'm Otto Othman. Thanks for watching.